Hey guys, Kriben Govender from the Gut Health Gurus podcast. I'm a food scientist. My background, my sidekick James Shadrick is unfortunately busy today on another appointment. He's double booked himself, so I'm flying solo and kind of winging it with my audio and video. But I have an absolutely amazing guest for you today. His name is Sandor Katz. I'm pretty sure if you're in the gut health and fermentation world, you would have come across Sandor, his work, his books, his inspiration, because I would say he's been one of the guys that's been flying the fermentation flag for quite some time. So Sandor, firstly, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Sandor, what I'd typically like to do to set the scene for my audience is to ask the question, really, and to get it from the horse's mouth, for want of a better word. Who is Sandor Katz?
I think what brings me here is that I am a fermentation revivalist, and I got interested in / obsessed with fermentation about 25 years ago. 26 years ago now, and went down the rabbit hole and learned about fermenting lots of different things. Started noticing how good fermented foods made me feel. Shared the products of fermentation that I was making with people in my life. Ended up getting invited to teach workshops in fermentation that led me to writing a book about fermentation. And I've been full-time, I'd say, for the last 16 years as a fermentation educator. Traveling, all around, all around the US and North America, and, increasingly other parts of the world, just sharing with people easy techniques for fermenting in home kitchens, restaurant kitchens, and of course, learning about fermentation, because fermentation is practiced in, infinitely varied permutations in culinary traditions in every part of the world. So, always learning more about fermentation, always experimenting in my home kitchen, meeting lots of other people who are interested in this phenomenon, and just always, curious to broaden the context for thinking about it, and, learning new different kinds of ferments. So that's not necessarily the totality of who I am, but I think that, that gives us enough to work with.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful intro. And what I'd like to do is just let's jump in a time machine and take a step back. I think you mentioned 14 years ago, that first moment when you, I guess, was there a particular health concern or something that led you to discover fermented foods?
Well, like most people, I grew up with some fermented foods. So, it's not that they suddenly became part of my life where they hadn't been part of my life before. I guess I would say that there are, kind of three main sort of periods of my deepening interest in fermentation. So, as a kid, I wasn't thinking about fermentation at all, but, my grandparents who were in my life were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and, we always ate pickles. My grandmother wasn't making them. We were buying them at a corner delicatessen, but that was just part of the flavor palette that I grew up with. And I loved pickles. Pickles were one of my favorite foods. So, something predisposed me to, really, really enjoying this particular flavor of fermentation, which I think sour flavors are very accessible to kids. And as a kid, I loved the sour fermented pickles that we would eat. When I was in my mid-20s, which would be in the late 80s, I spent a couple of years experimenting with a macrobiotic diet. And I mean, not really for any particular reason. Like I was just, you know, in a phase of life where I was, you know, interested in trying different things. And one of the things that macrobiotics really emphasizes is the digestive benefit of pickles and other live ferments that are not cooked after their fermentation. And during this period, I started noticing that these pickles that I had loved my entire life, that I had been eating my entire life, that when I would eat them, and even like looking at them, thinking about them right now, talking about them, like I could feel my little salivary glands under my tongue squirting out saliva. And in a very tangible way, I started associating these foods with getting my digestive juices flowing. But I still really wasn't making any ferments myself, like up to that point. There were, you know, sort of lots of high quality options easily available. But in 1993, I moved from New York City, which was my hometown, to rural Tennessee, where I still live. And one of the things I got involved with in this change of life, moving to a rural area, was keeping a garden. And this was nothing I had ever done before. And, you know, I was such a naive city kid that I had never really thought about the idea that in a garden, all of the cabbages would be ready at around the same time. All of the radishes would be ready at around the same time. So when I was faced for the first time with this reality of food production and, you know, agricultural cycles, I decided I should learn how to make sauerkraut. You know, we had a bunch of cabbage. I knew that I loved sauerkraut. I knew that it couldn't be that hard to make. I knew that it was considered a practical way of preserving cabbage and other vegetables. So, you know, I looked in The Joy of Cooking, which is your sort of most, basic kitchen reference cookbook in the US. And I learned how to make sauerkraut from The Joy of Cooking. And, you know, that first batch of sauerkraut was just so delicious and made me feel so good. And I just couldn't believe how straightforward the process was. Like literally you chop cabbage, you salt the cabbage lightly to taste, add caraway seeds or whatever other seasoning you like. Now I would say any other vegetables that you like. You know, you get the veggies juicy by squeezing them while they're salted. And once they're juicy, you just pack them into a jar or a crock or, you know, whatever your vessel is, and leave them for a few days, a few weeks, a few months. The flavor will intensify. But, you know, once I just saw how easy, straightforward it was, how delicious it was, I just got hooked and started like learning how to ferment other things, how to do other kinds of fermented vegetables like kimchi, like the sour pickles that I grew up eating. I started playing around with sourdough baking, like leavening with like a natural starter from the organisms that, you know, are found on grains. I started playing around with country wines, like, you know, very simple, elderberry or blueberry or different kinds of fruit wines. I learned how to make miso. I learned how to make tempeh, and you know, I just started, you know, exploring the world of fermentation, and I I found it to be, you know, fascinating as well as delicious and very satisfying, and then that first time when I got invited to teach a workshop. See, I had sort of fallen into this interest without any particular fear about it. But the first time I tried to teach people how to make sauerkraut is when I encountered, you know, the fear. You know, all of these people who've been told all of their lives how dangerous bacteria are, you know, when confronted with the idea of cultivating bacteria on vegetables in a jar, just panicked. And you know, the big question on people's minds was, you know, how can I be sure I have good bacteria growing, you know, on the cabbage in this jar and not, you know, some dangerous bacteria that might make me sick, that might kill somebody. So, you know, people can easily project all of the anxiety they've ever had about bacteria, you know, onto a jar of sauerkraut. And, you know, what's funny and amusing about that is that like there really are hardly any foods that are as safe as sauerkraut. I mean, the statistics are stark. There's no case history of illness or food poisoning from any kind of fermented vegetables. So, the reason that your jar of sauerkraut isn't going to make you or someone else sick is that it never makes anybody sick. There's just no case history of illness from it. And even if you were to, take vegetables that had been exposed to some sort of incidental contamination in the field or in handling, the reality is that the indigenous bacteria of the cabbage would easily dominate over any introduced contaminants. And as they begin to acidify the cabbage, they would knock out the contaminants. They would no longer be found. And, one of the very sort of elegant facts about fermentation and other means of acidifying food is that acidifying food preserves food so safely because the organisms we hear the names of, the organisms that have the potential to make us sick, can't survive in a sufficiently acidic environment. So once you reach a certain level of acidity, the generally agreed upon pH would be 4.6. For most government regulators. But once you reach that level of acidity, there's just no even theoretical danger to it. Like most fermentation processes, the sauerkraut really is a strategy for food safety as much as anything else. But, once I started, facing these issues and seeing, how scary it was for people, this, method of producing food that we all eat every day, but that has just largely disappeared from our immediate experience. I don't know, I got very drawn to the idea of just demystifying this process for people and helping people, understand how they can do it, safely, effectively, creatively, in home kitchens.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been, there's just been a huge amount of interest. I mean, fermented foods and beverages have really enjoyed enduring popularity around the world. It's not like, bread and cheese and wine and beer and sauerkraut are just sort of suddenly out of nowhere becoming popular. But, certainly there is, heightened awareness and interest in the phenomenon of fermentation. I think because of awareness of the microbiome and people recognizing for the first time ever, like how important bacteria are to our, overall health and well-being, and that, eating bacteria-rich foods are a great way of restoring biodiversity in the gut.
Yeah, totally. So if I could just summarize the beautiful, eloquent monologue, and it was just so free flowing, and I didn't want to interrupt the flow. It was just so beautifully put together. But it sounds like your roots back in, is it Hungary where you're originally from?
Well, it's funny. My name Sandor is a Hungarian name, but
Right.
My mother's parents, who I grew up with, were from what's now Belarus, and
Okay.
my father's family that came over a generation earlier, that was from Lithuania.
Right.
So Eastern European Jewish roots. Yeah.
Okay. So the Eastern European, I guess the culture does have a lot of fermented foods in there. So it sounds like from a very early age, you've had exposure to, I guess, this beautiful sour taste. And I can think back when I was a kid as well, and I've got my own kids as well, and they love that, they sour lollies. So it's almost innately built into us. I'm just purely anecdotal, but it's built into us to have a preference for these sour type tasting foods.
Well, I mean, I would agree, but I would say that it's important to expose kids early to the sour flavors of pickles and sauerkraut. Like, if a kid is exposing like a teething age to that, they will love it forever. But, if a kid's first introduction to it is when they're 9 years old, they're generally not going to embrace it in a enthusiastic way at that point in their life.
I hear you. I think our supermarkets and our food supply is so laden with sweet type flavors. So, potentially if a kid's exposed to a lot of sweet tasting things, maybe sweet will trump sour. So I'm with you on that one. Getting these sour, fermented foods in as early as feasible is probably a good strategy to get children accustomed to it.
And of course, certain fermented foods and beverages have, very strong flavors. I mean, I would say many of the strongest flavored foods that there are products of fermentation. I'm thinking of, certain really ripe, strong cheeses, or like in the Chinese context, some of the fermented tofu that I have encountered. In the Japanese context, maybe natto. But, there are certain fermented foods and beverages that have very strong flavors that are really acquired tastes that, if you're just not growing up, in a context of tasting things like that, you might find them very, very off-putting.
Yeah.
When you encounter them later in life. Oh, the Swedish fermented fish, surströmming. That's a great example of this.
I'd imagine I've never actually tried fermented fish before, but I'm thinking something really strong with amines. Ammonia comes to mind when a protein kind of ferments down. So I'd actually love to try it. I'm planning to go to Europe soon, so maybe if I come across a Scandinavian restaurant, I'll give it a go and report back. So,
well, there's lots of styles of fermented fish, probably some of which you have tried. I mean, the fish sauces that are found in contemporary Southeast Asian cuisines. That's fermentation of fish. That's a fermentation that breaks down the fish. There are also fermentations that really preserve the fish. I mean, if you think about sushi, and try to imagine what sushi was before refrigeration, you would only eat raw sushi out of a powerful refrigerator.
Yeah.
But the tradition of sushi is really more about using rice as the bed for fermenting fish, and the acidity from the fermentation of the rice is what preserves the fish. And there elsewhere in Asia, I have encountered traditions of fermenting rice fermenting fish with rice, or sometimes also meat with rice. And it doesn't always have a strong flavor. It depends a lot on how long it's allowed to ferment. Any ferment can be done in a sort of milder, less strong flavored version, or if you give it more time, and there's more time for fermentation byproducts to accumulate, it could have a stronger flavor.
No, that's a fantastic point that you raised. There's all these different types of products that we don't realize that are fermented, like something like simple as a fish sauce, or I think or even coffee or chocolate. So these are all types of fermented foods. And then to your point on not having refrigeration, so fermentation being the salting process as a preservative means, a very natural, healthy way of preserving foods. And then you talked about rice, which is I'm not sure whether you want to go into it, but to talk about koji. So that's something really interesting to me. So do you think that was there some element of the yeast and molds in rice that were helping to preserve the fish?
Well, so one of the limitations in preserving meat or fish through fermentation is that the fermentation byproducts that preserve the acids and the alcohol ferment from carbohydrates. And meat and fish have lots of protein. Depending on the type, they can have lots of fat, but what they never have a lot of is carbohydrates. So when you ferment them with rice or other grains or starchy tubers, you're providing a very rich carbohydrate base. And then the carbohydrates really ferment, and the acids produced from the fermentation of the carbohydrates are able to effectively preserve the meat. But you need to introduce some kind of a carbohydrate. Like in contemporary salami making, they just add a little bit of sugar, like a very, like a couple of percentages of sugar is totally enough carbohydrates to, get the acidification that they need to happen quickly.
Gotcha. Speaking of salami was an interesting one, because when I was in probably very early high school, one of my local guys in the neighborhood was Hungarian. And so I used to just go over and play. And then he first introduced me to Hungarian salami. And that was probably one of my earliest experiences with a proper fermented food.
And did you like it from the get-go?
Yeah, I loved it. And so every time I would go over, I would ask his mum, do you have any of that salami? And you know what? These guys were pretty traditional, so they were making it themselves. So it was like a fan recipe, and it was amazing. And it's still one of my favorite foods. And, I try and find it, like things like salami or small goods have become so processed these days. So I try and find something that's as natural and artisan as possible, so that I know it doesn't have all these chemicals and preservatives. It's done using the old techniques. But I love it. I love it. So Sandor, what is your favorite fermented food?
Oh, you're really going to have to make me think about that. It's so funny because I do get asked this question pretty regularly, and it's such an impossible question for me because, I got interested in fermentation because I love food. Like I love lots of different kinds of foods. And certainly I'm very devoted to fermenting vegetables, like pickles, sauerkraut, kimchi, love them all. But do I love them more than I love cheese? That's hard. Do I love them more than I love beer? I don't know. So I don't know. I'm so glad I don't have to decide. I'm so glad that the world is full of, such an incredible diversity of different fermentation processes. And, that's part of what I love about fermentation, is just how diverse it is, how, sort of infinitely varied people have made it, how, you can take something that's sort of so traditional and codified in a certain part of the world, and then you can take the basic process and you can just totally play with it. You can take a process that's been applied to, soybeans in Japan for thousands of years, and then try it with black-eyed peas, try it with pistachios, try it with bacon. And people are just making miso out of the most outrageous protein substrates these days, that are so far from the original application of it. And I just find that super, super exciting and inspirational. And nobody's invented any new fermented foods or beverages for hundreds, arguably thousands of years, but there's a lot of kind of cross-pollination happening right now, and people taking very traditional processes from one part of the world and applying them to very different kinds of ingredients, and I find that exciting. And I wish I had an easy answer for my favorite fermented food. But I love so many of them, really.
Yeah, no, that's such a cool answer, because I kind of approach fermented foods, or my journey has been pretty much from a health perspective. So I tend to favor certain fermented foods from a scientific perspective based on the types of bacteria. And then you've got someone like yourself that comes from totally different space, more artisan, more kind of for the love of food and love of flavors. So I love that answer. That why limit yourself to just one when you got this plethora?
And I think even if you're thinking of it primarily in terms of probiotics and sort of optimizing the probiotic benefit of fermentation. And people often pose the question, what's the best fermented food to eat for probiotic benefit. And, I really, in my, sort of synthesis of the, various bits of information that I've, sort of collected regarding probiotics in general, I would say that the objective of probiotic therapy is biodiversity. It's encouraging, restoring, rebuilding biodiversity. And for that simple reason, there's no singular food that is the be all and end all, because each different kind of fermented food, arguably each manifestation from a different producer in a different place, will have different microbial communities. And sure, some of them will have sort of more higher bacterial count, greater biodiversity. But eating and drinking a diversity of live fermented products, definitely gets more different kinds of organisms, into our bodies than, just picking one as, the answer to our problems. And, which, you can get a steady flow of bacteria from eating the same food every day, but you just get a more varied flow of bacteria if you mix it up a little bit and have some yogurt, have some sauerkraut, have some kimchi, have some kombucha, have some ginger beer. No one of these is like the ultimate source of probiotics, and the benefits, I would say, are magnified by diversity.
I'm 100% with you. If you look at all the science coming out on the microbiome, there is a lot of debate on many topics, but when it comes to biodiversity in the gut, I think everybody is in agreement that just like any ecological system, the gut is the same, like a rainforest. The more different types of organisms that are in there, it's typically reflected in a healthier state in the body. So I'm 100% with you. And this is what I sort of recommend to my members and my tribe, that to introduce as many different types of fermented foods as possible, whether it be kimchi, kombucha, kefir, they're all different. So thank you for highlighting that so beautifully. What's your thoughts on kefir?
Well, I love kefir. I love the flavor of kefir. I love how kefir makes me feel.
Yeah.
Kefir is also a big responsibility.
Yes.
Once you have some kefir grains, you've got to keep feeding them. Like they do not take very well to long periods of neglect.
Yeah,
so, my life at this point involves so much traveling that I don't even try to maintain kefir grains. They require more, kind of steadiness and consistency than I am able to give them. But I've seen some very impressive kefir grains in my travels. Oh my God, this guy in California who I met, he had like a single blob of kefir that was all connected, and it took two hands to hold it. And it's the only time I've ever seen anything like that. But I love kefir. Sadly, there's very little commercially available true kefir, and in the US, it's virtually impossible because there's products you could buy called kefir, and they basically are made from a powdered starter culture that perhaps was originally derived from kefir, but where they left out some of the organisms that were viewed as problematic. And kefir, among the 30 something different organisms that are part of kefir, one of them is the fungus popular known as Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So that will transform lactose into alcohol. And so in parts of the world where the legal threshold for alcoholic beverages is 0.5%, like the US, it's just not practical to sell true kefir unless you were just trying to sell it as an alcoholic beverage. Whereas in some parts of the world, like in the UK, I'm not sure what the situation is in Australia, but where the threshold is 1% alcohol, people are marketing true kefir. So, if you're in a place where you can't buy true kefir, it's a wonderful thing to make. You just have to find someone with grains. And because everybody who does it for any length of time ends up with way more grains than they know what to do with, they're not that hard. They're not that hard to find. You just have to, do some networking with other local fermentation enthusiasts, and you probably can find some kefir grains. But I love kefir. It's incredibly delicious. I also love yogurt. I make yogurt. Every couple of months I make a batch of yogurt, and yogurt doesn't need the kind of daily attention that kefir does.
Yeah, I hear. I mean, our community, our Nourish Me Organics community, are deeply, deeply entrenched in the benefits of kefir. Milk kefir certainly has tons of research and good, solid research behind the efficacy, if I say it properly.
Yeah.
And you highlighted it brilliantly that the yeast are absolutely vital. Something like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and there's lots of other different types of yeast. We've done a full genomic study on kefir grains as well, and there is a host of different types of organisms, and the yeasts are equally as important. They all work symbiotically together. So hence, that's an excellent point on the alcohol. The alcohol threshold here is similar to the US, which is 0.5%. So in reality, you're never going to find a true, or certainly in Australia, you're not going to find a true kefir or milk kefir anytime soon. And even water kefir, I think, because they're so strict on the alcohol regulations, if it's tested above 0.5%, you need a liquor license. And I can understand, there's mums, there's children. And I agree with you, Sandor. The best thing to do is to make it yourself. So exactly, if you've got the patience to kind of maintain it. It's like a child. You've got to keep feeding it. It's like a sourdough culture. It's the same sort of situation where it requires a lot of attention, but it's so rewarding. And I love
maybe not as much attention as having a child, but
not quite.
Maybe more like a small pet.
A small pet. That's probably more apt analogy. Sometimes I think of my kefir grains as, as tedious as my children's. So, and I like how you highlighted a point, and I'll just come back to it, how it makes you feel. So you mentioned that you could feel the difference when you have kefir.
Yeah. I think these foods can be really, these foods are energizing. The nutrients in these foods are very highly bioavailable. And in general, I find that these live fermented foods make me feel really good. And, I certainly don't follow any, diet like where I only eat fermented foods or anything like that. I don't think that that's necessary or desirable or appropriate, but I definitely eat them regularly. I'm not saying a day has never gone by where I haven't eaten some, but pretty much every day I'm eating fermented foods. My days are better if I'm eating some fermented foods. I think of a lot of fermented foods as condiments. So I think of them as, embellishments, something I'll put on a sandwich, something I'll eat with my eggs, something I'll mix in with my, rice and vegetables and meat that I'm eating for dinner. I just always like to put a little bit on the plate.
Cool. We're coming up to time pretty soon. I've just got a couple of more questions, if you wouldn't mind sticking around. Just
Go for it. Go for it.
So something that, someone like yourself that's such a guru in this space and so inspiring to others. There's a couple of things that it's a bit selfish of me to ask, but what do you think is the origin of something like a kefir or kombucha? Because it's so conflicting when you look at the lore and the stories behind it.
Well, I mean, we don't know the origins of any of these things. We don't know the origins of anything that we eat. We have our old joke, which came first, the chicken or the egg? But,
Yeah.
the reality is like nobody knows. So, we have rough ideas of the, sort of geographical origins of these foods. So kefir comes from the Caucasus Mountains. And anyone from the Caucasus Mountains could tell you where kefir grains came from, which is that they were a gift for the people from Allah,
Mm.
that Muhammad brought to the people. Myself, I'm a little bit more of a skeptic, and I don't necessarily accept the origin stories at face value. So, I'm picturing that in a region where lots of families had goats and goat's milk, and people typically stored the goat's milk in some sort of a animal lining, whether it's a skin or a bladder or something like that, but something that they would hang above the door. And people would, part of the sort of ritual of the place was people agitating that fermenting milk above the doorway. And some families started, finding these little blobs, these little rubbery blobs, the kefir grains in their milk, and their milk had a delicious flavor and texture. And people started associating that delicious flavor and texture with those little globules that formed in the milk. And there were more and more of them, so they started sharing them with their neighbors and their family and their friends. And eventually it became a regional a specialty. But I mean, where did the first yogurt come from? We could say oh, okay, it was the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. It was a very hot day because it involved thermophilic bacteria. But I mean, these spontaneous events happen. It doesn't mean that you can replicate them, in any environment. Like, they happened in some specific place under some specific set of conditions. People figured out methods by which they could replicate them and expand them, but it doesn't mean that anybody can have the spontaneous experience of having it occur in the first place. And I mean, that's really what fermentation is it's like, this sort of set of techniques that people, figured out really in the absence of scientific information for how to, sort of perpetuate the results of some, accidental thing that was pleasing in some way, because it made the food more stable, more delicious. It produced alcohol. It removed some, toxic or foul compound. But there's people recognize some benefit, and therefore, sort of sought to replicate the process.
How about water kefir? What's your thoughts on the origin story of that?
Well, so water kefir, as far as I can tell, bears no specific relationship whatsoever to the milk culture that we call kefir. Water kefir, as best I can tell, has its origins in Mexico, where it is known as tibicos. And the story is that the first crystalline structures of tibicos were found in the subcutaneous layer of prickly pears. Now, I have explored some prickly pears looking for them. I have never found them. So, maybe they only developed under a very specific condition. Maybe that story is not true. Maybe it's only some very particular variety. I mean, it's hard to say. But water kefir, I believe comes from the opposite side of the world as kefir. Kefir is from the Caucasus Mountains. Water kefir, tibicos, I believe, is from Mexico.
And how about kombucha?
Kombucha, my general idea is it's from somewhere in the north of China, but somewhere in China.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just a couple more questions. So everybody knows the fermented vegetables. They know kefir, kombucha. What's some really interesting ones that maybe people have never heard about that they might like to explore?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, what you've heard about depends entirely on where you come from.
Sure.
You know, I mean, I would just really encourage people to not assume that they know everything about sauerkraut and kimchi. And there's a vast amount of regional variation, and you can ferment any vegetables for different lengths of time, cut up differently, big pieces, beverages, relishes. You know, there's a lot of different possibilities within the realm of fermenting vegetables. So don't, you know, please don't write that off as just like beginner stuff. But you can ferment anything. I mean, what like a particular you know, interest of mine is the fermentation of grains. And like, you know, we were just talking about the fermentation of meat with grains. You can ferment everything else with grains. And people do ferment everything else with grains. And, you know, in contrast with fermenting vegetables, where really preservation is, you know, is your primary objective, because vegetables, you know, are highly perishable, and in temperate climates, you can only grow vegetables in certain parts of the year, and so that preservation of vegetables has been, you know, really made sustaining healthy life possible through the winter in places with long, harsh winters, and it's been really important. But when you ferment grains, it's never about preservation, because grains in their mature state, when they're dry, preserve perfectly. Just all you have to do is keep them dry. But that same some of the same qualities that enable grains to store for so long make them difficult for us to digest. And so, you know, the fermentation of grains makes them much more digestible. It makes minerals in them more accessible to us. It gives something that's got very plain flavor, more pronounced flavor, and it makes something that can be really dense into something that's light and more pleasant to eat. But you know, I love the South Indian method of fermenting rice and lentils, dosa and idli. Incredibly simple processes where you soak the rice, you soak the lentils, then you put them together in a grinder or a blender with a little bit of the soaking water, and grind them into a paste and ferment that in a very hot tropical place for probably just about 8 hours, in a warm temperate place, maybe 24 hours, in a cool temperate place, maybe 48 hours. Once it's rising, then dosas are crepes of this, and so delicious. And then idlis are these steam breads of this. I love this Afro-Brazilian similar ferment called acarajé, where you take black-eyed peas and you soak them overnight, and then you blend them into a batter, and then you do these fry breads of the black-eyed peas, which are incredibly delicious. I've been making, a friend of mine who is just diagnosed with celiac disease, I've been making her buckwheat bread, where I take whole buckwheat, raw buckwheat, and I soak it, blend it into a batter, add a little bit of salt, rise it for 24 hours, then put it into a well-greased loaf pan with lots of seeds lining it, and bake bread out of that, or you can make pancakes out of that. But I mean, I just think we can make grains so much more delicious, so much more easily digestible, with really simple fermentation techniques that are really found, you know, all around the world, or like in you know, culinary traditions virtually everywhere. So that's something that excites me, that I would, you know, encourage people to play around with.
Absolutely. And it's such a good way to encourage more vegetable consumption as well, because we can make it really interesting by fermenting it in terms of the flavors, textures, organoleptic qualities of the food. So anything that can get us away from overconsumption of meat into more plant food diversity, I'm 100% supportive of. So that's absolutely brilliant. And those recipes that you mentioned, do you have them on a blog somewhere, or where people can access them? Or
Sure. Well, I mean, the easiest place is my book, Wild Fermentation. So all those things that I just mentioned are in my book, Wild Fermentation.
So
And the internet is a wonderful place to look for recipes too. Like if you hear about something like dosas, and you don't have the right book in front of you, if you just search on the internet, you're going to find hundreds, probably thousands of food bloggers from the diaspora who are like sharing their family methods of doing it.
sure, and YouTube's a huge one as well, a huge database of recipes. And what we will do is we will definitely link to your book in the show notes. So if people want to deep dive with Sandor and his recipes, absolute genius in terms of fermented foods, brilliant. So we'll link to those in the show notes. So just to wrap everything up, I know your time is very precious. And just a parting question I like to ask my guests is, if there was one thing that someone could do to improve their gut health, what would it be, Sandor?
Well, I mean, I will say fermented foods, but I'll also say as important, some would argue more important than the probiotics are the prebiotics, and just, eating lots of high fiber food, a lot of tubers and leafy green vegetables. And, you can have all the probiotics in the world, and if you're not eating the kinds of nutrients that can nourish them along the entire length of the intestine, they're not going to flourish as well as they can. So, just eating, the right kinds of, complex carbohydrates, polysaccharides, the kinds of things that really take length of our digestive system to break down, are the ones that are going to really nourish all those probiotics that we're eating.
Sure, I'm 100% with you. You can put the good guys in there, but you've got to put the food for the good guys as well to help them to flourish in the gut. Sandor, thank you so much for giving me your time. I think it's in the afternoon for you. It's in the morning for me. I highly appreciate it, and looking forward.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, and looking forward to your next adventures, and I'll be following along very closely, and I'm sure the audience here will be following on your journey as well. So thank you so much, Sandor.
Great. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. See you later. Thanks, Sandor. That was awesome.
Great. Send me a link when you post it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send you a link so you can share to your audience and all the people following along on your journey. But really appreciate your time, Sandor.
Okay, great. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
See you later.